Hey everybody! I'm so excited to see so many familiar names in the sidebar, and a lot of folks that I don't know. So really excited to be here, and I really want to thank the organizers. And I'll say more about that as the talk continues. Oh, Christy, before you, I just want to double check. Should I? This is a 40-minute talk. Is that right?
You have time for 1 hour, so this
Okay.
talk will finish at 5 p.m. UTC.
Awesome. Okay, great. So we'll have time for questions. So feel free to put any questions that you want in the chat and to generally participate. Often, if I do a pre-recorded talk, I really like to heckle myself. So feel free to ask questions as we go, and I'll do my best to answer them. So I'm going to tell you just a tiny bit about myself. Many of you already know me. My name is Karen Sandler, and I am really interested in software freedom for a variety of issues, but one of those things, and I was talking about this in the chat just a moment ago, is that I have a big heart. I have, oh, okay, so, trying to turn down, BA suggests turning down my, my gain a little bit, so I will do that. How's that? Is that a little bit better? I'll just keep continuing and we can adjust as we go. So I have a big heart. I have a heart condition. It's called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and that means that my heart is literally thicker than a normal person's heart. And I have it means that when it beats, it sort of beats a little bit less efficiently, and this is generally not a problem. But I have a very high risk of suddenly dying, and that's the medical term that they use is called sudden death. And so I have a pacemaker defibrillator implanted right in my chest, and it's screwed into my heart with a wire, and it monitors my heart. And if I get into a dangerous rhythm, then it shocks me. And this is actually a picture of my old defibrillator that used to be in my body, and you can see that there's like a little like dents and scratches, which I think is when they pried it out. I think it's really cool to be able to see the stuff that that was once a part of me. And so getting this defibrillator caused, I've given talks about this before, and I won't talk about it for too long here, but it caused me to reevaluate the technology that we rely on and my own technology, and instead of feeling a little bit helpless from the whole procedure, I feel like is a very empowering thing. And so I like to think of myself as a cyborg, and I'm a lawyer as well. And so I like to think of myself as a cyborg lawyer, which is in a way quite terrifying. And I basically, through that whole experience, became very passionate about software freedom. I once upon a time was lawyer to lots and lots of free and open source software projects, and that included both GNOME and KDE. So that was pretty cool. There's a question of why does it have two serial codes, and it's that one is the model number and one is the serial code. So we were putting questions in the public chat now that I'll respond to, and we can go to the shared notes later, and after the talk is over. So all of this caused me to believe that software transparency was really important, and we needed to be able to audit our code. When I have an engineering background and then became a lawyer, and not being able to see the source code of my own body was quite upsetting. And so that caused me to be a real advocate for software freedom, and gave me the opportunity to advocate for GNOME and other free and open source software projects in that way. And I thought that it was all about transparency. And then when I was pregnant, I got shocked unnecessarily by my defibrillator, because my heart was palpitating, which is super normal for pregnant women. It's about a quarter to a third of all women they estimate have palpitations. And so because my heart was palpitating, but I had a defibrillator. It thought that my heart was in a dangerous rhythm, and it shocked me, even though I didn't need to be shocked. And the only way for me to stop my defibrillator from giving me unnecessary treatment was to take drugs that slowed my heart rate down, so much so that I had a hard time walking up a flight of stairs. And it was like really hard to get my head around when this happened, and it was a little bit upsetting. But ultimately, it worked out okay because the drugs were fine. I managed to, I had the baby and everything was fine. And but it really was a very interesting experience, because what I learned from it is that even though everybody involved in the process had the best of intentions, right? Even though everybody who worked at the medical device manufacturer and all of the medical technicians and the doctors all wanted to help me and provide me with life-saving technology, my use case was not a use case that was anticipated by the manufacturers, because a very small number of people at any given time are pregnant and have defibrillators. Only 15% of defibrillators go to people under the age of 65. So when I raised this to my to like the head of high risk obstetrics at my hospital where I gave birth, she said, I've only once had a patient with a defibrillator. I've had pacemaker patients, but not defibrillator patients. Anyway, so it really stood for this proposition of like, well, there are going to be lots of use cases that the manufacturers don't anticipate, even if everyone has the best of intentions. And the only way that we will be able to have technology that we rely on over time is by making sure that it's free and open, and that we have control over it as a society, and have the ability to have collective action. So that's a it was a really defining moment for me, and it really changed the lens for me of how I view software freedom. And so I think of software freedom as a deeply personal issue, and even though we rely often on collective action in order to make sure that, like, to take advantage of software freedom, especially for folks that are not developers, the ideas behind software freedom and making sure that our technology is safe for us to rely on are deeply intertwined. And so that's I wanted to just give you that introduction so you can understand where I'm coming from and how I see the whole software freedom movement. So, and incidentally, that picture was taken at a GWADEC. And all this to say, so now this is many years later, and we are in a pandemic, and I miss all of you. I just want to start that. I was looking down this list of names, and there are so many people who I care so deeply about, and I miss you. I also miss those of you who I don't know, because as someone who is trying to advocate for better technology, for a better society, for for things to improve, I can't do that alone. I'm only one advocate, and so much has happened over the last year, and I look forward to conferences and interactions to reset myself, and also to hear what all of you think, so I can learn, and so that we can better function as a movement. And so I really can't underscore how much I miss seeing all of you and talking to you. So and thinking about that, and thinking about how special this conference is, and how it comes out of, it's such a collaborative process. It made me think of this conference, and if anybody can post in the public chat if they can guess what conference this is, and I'd be curious to see if anyone could guess it. So I'll just leave it for just a second longer so that people could figure it out, and I'm curious if anyone's gonna guess it. Okay. All right, so we're gonna move on to the next slide, but keep putting your guesses in, and I'll let you know later on if anyone gets it right. Okay. So, we rely on conferences a lot. in order to reset our remote communities, because we're all working around the world, and of course no one was better prepared for a pandemic in a way than we were, in terms of the remote nature of avoiding other people in person. Like, we were very well situated to deal with working from home. Almost all of us that and again, looking at the list of names on the side, those of you who I know, almost all of you were, or a very high percentage of you were already working from home before the pandemic already happened. And Conservancy, which is the organization that I work for, the Software Freedom Conservancy, we're a charitable nonprofit that is a fiscal sponsor, and so we've got around 50 member projects. And we're also known for working on defending the GPL and enforcing copyleft, and also for our project, member project Outreachy, which I'll talk about in a little bit too. So we at Conservancy were already a remote organization, but not going to conferences was really a change, and not being able to see people. Luna mentions that it is always better to see people online than not at all, and I think that is exactly right, and that is why we are here today, because even though we can't be in person and it's not the same, it's still really important for us to get together and share our ideas, and sync up. And I went forward on the slide, so I'm going to have to go back again. But this picture is it's a photo I found that's marked in public domain, where it's a doll. It looks like the doll's working remotely. It looks like the doll has a keyboard, but when you look a little closer, it's actually a television remote, which really astounded me when I noticed that. So the upside to this, the huge win, was that we were ready to deal with this kind of situation. We know how to communicate with each other from afar. We know how to communicate asynchronously, and we know how to communicate synchronously when using various online communication tools. And we had a lot of tools going into this that we had already developed and relied on and worked into our communities before the pandemic. So this is one of those situations where we are so, like, we were so ahead of the curve, both in understanding what it means to work remotely, and how to gather people together to discuss important issues remotely, but also we were ready technologically with the tools that would help us to do that with software freedom. But unfortunately, that the fact that we had these tools and that they were really good did not help us to spread the use of those tools generally. I think I can do a poll. Can I do a poll? Yes, I can. I'm going to set up a really super quick poll. No, I think I set up an accidental I set up an accidental yes or no poll, I think, which failed. Anyway, I guess just I was just looking for a yes or no for people who who have friends and relatives who started using teleconferencing or other remote tools that had not used it before. I would guess it's actually oh, I did a yes, no, yeah, okay, yes and yes. I was wondering if oh yeah, okay, so people are saying yes, they did know. Probably almost everybody here has someone or many people who had never used any of these remote tools and started using them. And I was so, we were all in a negative emotional state when the pandemic started. Of course, there were very serious issues, and there have been very serious issues, both related directly to COVID-19, but also to a lot of political situations throughout the world during this time. And so it's been an extremely stressful time in a variety of ways. But at the beginning of the pandemic, part of me was thinking, well, at least this is a great opportunity for us to be able to get people to use the tools that we have started to work on. And it was in a way exciting, but at the same time, what really happened is that people jumped on the proprietary tools that were already there. Many people who had never heard of Zoom before started talking about Zoom fatigue as if they had been using Zoom their whole lives. It was, really, really fascinating. A parent group at my kid's school, they set up a Slack room, and they were encouraging people to join. And even though I suggested we use one of the other solutions instead, and set it up and made it available, I did not somehow do that in a way that was effective enough that people felt like they would adopt it. They all used these proprietary tools that had been standing around and that were also functioning at the same time, even though many of them had a very steep learning curve for the proprietary tools, and which would have been similar to the free and open source software tools. And so it was extremely disappointing because the ability to have people come onto our solutions that could have been customizable, that could have had so many more, could have had follow-on effects for investment in the technology, didn't really materialize. And so one of the deep disappointments of the pandemic is that folks began to understand a little bit more about our lives, the way we collaborate and the way we conduct our communities all around the world. But at the same time, we failed to bring our solutions, and we failed to, we did in some ways, and I'll get to that too. So I don't want to be too negative, but negotiating these power dynamics is really, really hard. When people are under deep stress, it's very difficult to say, well, I know you want to talk to someone and they want to, and I know you want to talk to me and you want to use Zoom, but will you use Jitsi? Will you use Big Blue Button? Can we talk about that? And what I found was that you have to really evaluate what the power dynamic is and where you stand on that. How can you be considerate of other people's mental state and their needs while also being a zealous advocate, being a really persuasive advocate, and being appropriately uncompromising? And this is really, really difficult. An example of what I found, for example, is that here's a good one. So my one of my children takes violin lessons, and the violin teacher suggested a proprietary tool. I think it was FaceTime, but because I pay that teacher for lessons, it was very easy for me to say, okay, this is a situation, I have control over this situation, so I'm going to ask to move it to a free solution, even though it's a little bit of an inconvenience, and I can offer to pay for that time, that if there's any learning time. And it turns out these, that one was Jitsi. Jitsi is so easy to use, and so is Big Blue Button. There wasn't any time for training, but the teacher appreciated that offer, and then it was easy to move to that. Whereas an institutional decision, so I teach a class at Columbia Law School, and they had made the decision to use Zoom. It was a non-starter to try to negotiate a move away from that for the whole for my class within the law school, and they have a whole structure for classes, but I could move my participation off to the extent that I could. So I made a Big Blue Button room, and that's what we used. And so it's tricky because it's alienating to run in and say, no, we must use only free tools, and if you don't, you're a bad person. It's not a great way, especially to deal with people when they're under stress. It's a great way to make them never want to work with you ever again. But at the same time, to use every ounce of our power in the situation to get people to use better tools, because by getting people to use better tools, it will improve things in the long run for everyone. And so, I think it's what we've learned is that it's particularly difficult to negotiate these power dynamics. And I think that in some ways we failed. And one of those ways was largely in so many conferences that were organized for free and open source software. were done were done in we're done using proprietary solutions. There were even conferences that were billed as software freedom, as free software conferences that were using proprietary software. And for those conferences, I think it's really important to meet people where they are. If people want to use the tools that they are going to use, and that means that people can hear your message more clearly, then it's worth using them. So, for example, a conference about ventilators that I attended, it's not, that's not within the software freedom community, but I could bring the ideas of software freedom to them. That's worth engaging with proprietary software to get people to move away from proprietary software. But conferences that are for software freedom, is it really a software freedom conference if it's on proprietary software and if all of the attendees have to use proprietary software? And so, I really had to figure out how to handle that. And in many situations, I recorded a talk using free software that included an explanation of why the proprietary software was bad. But I was disheartened and upset because, like, how could it seem like, how could it be that that we would need to rely on these proprietary solutions in order to have our conferences even amongst ourselves? And so it was really, really tough. But there were some wins in this time. And I would say that GWADEC last year was one of the first conferences that I went to that was a Big Blue Button conference, and it went remarkably well thanks to the sysadmin team. And then, and just the fact that we're meeting here using Big Blue Button is a huge win, and really reflects a ton of work from the conference organizers. So I'm, really grateful for that. And we have, about 100 people that are all here listening to this talk right now live. And I just, that it's a difficult task, and I'm really grateful for the organizers for doing that. I think the biggest software freedom win in conferences over the pandemic so far was FOSDEM. They invested an incredible amount of time and energy and resources in making FOSDEM online be completely free, and they were wildly successful. FOSDEM had, I think, in total around 40,000 people participate in it, and at one time, peak attendance was 33,000 attendees, and it was all done using a combination of those different tools that I had in the previous slide. And they had 25 simultaneous talks of the same, going on at any given time. I co-organized the legal and policy dev room, so I just have a screenshot of a panel that it was the organizers from that dev room. At our peak, we had almost 300 people just in our own dev room, and it all went completely well. And so the huge win is that we demonstrated that it was possible. There are a ton of conferences that are smaller that said that they couldn't possibly handle using free software to conduct the conference, but I'm so glad that FOSDEM demonstrated that it could be done on such a big scale, because now we know that it's possible, and if we can invest the resources, we can do it. And it was great. There were private rooms where organizers were able to talk to speakers and get them queued up and answer any questions and have them ready. And then there was the ability to invite participants of the track into a private room to have conversations with speakers after their talks, so that it simulated the hallway track. It was extremely successful, and I think was really exciting. And I really have to applaud the FOSDEM organizers for doing that, because now we know that it's just a matter of resources and that we can invest them and have a free format. So I think that was a huge win during the pandemic for software freedom, even though it's been so disappointing over and over again to be asked to use proprietary software. And I use this as a slide of a tweet where somebody posted a news of a German town that was running their own Jitsi server, so that schools and local choir groups don't have to rely on Skype and Zoom. And there are quite a lot of those small stories like that, schools that are using Big Blue Button, governments that are local governments that were making Jitsi and Big Blue Button available to their constituents so that they could avoid using free and open source software. And so and have some kind of local control. And I've been doing a bunch of of advocating with local politicians to explain to them how things could be done differently, and how if we have our own instances, that means that we have a lot of control over how that could be, and that there are companies that they could hire for support, and it creates a whole ecosystem, and then we could improve the tools themselves and not rely on big proprietary surveillance platforms. So, I think that it's easy to be negative about it because it's disheartening to be asked over and over again to use proprietary software. But one of the great things that came out is that we have the alternatives and we can offer them, and we just need to stick to our guns, but more importantly, provide the resources so that folks don't feel like folks do feel like the free options are really viable, and that they'll be supported when they do that. And each one of us should engage with our local politicians to let them know that this is the case. Try to move forward in the next slide. Oh, there we go. Oh, and I went to, of course. And so one of the conferences that I mentioned was the ventilator conference. There was one thing that has been really positive about the pandemic is that this idea that we need to come together as a community because there are real problems that we as a society can solve together. Right away, when we all began to understand the nature of the pandemic, people came together and started locally. People started making masks themselves and distributing them. I had a neighbor who just dropped off masks with any household that wanted them on the block. People started turning to how we can use 3D printing and other technology in order to help everybody else. And there was this case of a hospital in Italy that was using 3D printed valves, which worked out really well. There was some misinformation about whether there were threats made by the manufacturer over the patents on those devices, but ultimately the company was very happy for these valves to be printed locally to save lives. And there was this idea of we're in this together and we can all contribute together, that I think was a win for our society during the pandemic. There are a ton of open source ventilator projects. Public Invention has identified over 100, and this is one of the areas where we have difficulty because we have this idea that we're going to scratch our itch. And I don't need to tell a community that comes out of the desktop space how tough it is when you've got lots and lots of different viable solutions working on a similar problem, but not fully cooperating together. And this is, much more of the case in the ventilator space, since there are just so many of them, and there aren't just one or two that are really solving the problem that are able to work together whenever possible, the way GNOME and KDE have done for a long time. But in fact, the community is so fractured; it's so difficult, and part of it is also that there is the manufacturers are reluctant to participate in free and open source software solutions for a variety of reasons. But there's this idea that there's an obligation to share, that there's an obligation, at least during the pandemic, to help out folks that don't have the resources. And this is a picture of a ventilator where the manufacturer made the software available on a non-commercial license. And there have been a lot of examples of this during the pandemic. So one of the wins of the pandemic is this idea that people have understood that they shouldn't be holding back helping other people in order to prop up proprietary business models, but at the same time, so there's a desire to share, but at the same time, because this desire to share has not been articulated with the degree of depth that we understand in the software freedom movement, there are a lot of these halfway solutions which are applauded as being fantastic steps forward and huge steps towards sharing. And actually, they're not really. They are short-term solutions that work as advertising for the use of the products in the long run, and don't actually bring any kind of self-actualization or any independence to the communities that will be relying on them. So this I guess, as with anything, all of these wins and losses are deeply tied up together, and this is one of those things. And because there are a few people who are articulating why these narrow scope sharing licenses are problematic, and how because no one's articulating that in the mainstream, we're losing this opportunity to bring these messages. Like the idea to say, yes, this helps us with this pandemic, like with this pandemic situation today, but what about our next pandemic? Like if we don't democratize this technology, we're just going to be in the same situation the next time it happens. Or forget about a pandemic, another situation where there's a problem where we're relying on technology and communities don't have control over it all over the world. How will we solve that problem then? The answer is to think holistically about our technology instead of thinking about it on this piecemeal basis and demanding that companies are more upfront about their technology, and that they rely more on sharing licenses. So that was another huge win and loss, right? During the pandemic, individuals have been under so much stress, and while under ordinary circumstances, abusers use smart home devices to manipulate and abuse their partners, this became even more of a situation during the pandemic, where when folks were stuck at home, their problems that were endemic to home life became a lot worse. And so, for example, domestic abuse rose worldwide during COVID-19, which is, I think, not a huge surprise when you think about it. But that means that our technology is more critical than ever, and educating people about how to control their own technology, and also about coming together as communities to be able to vet our technology and to provide us with the granulated control that we deserve, has become all the more essential. So, obviously, I think this is just one of those situations where it's one example of how the pandemic has brought out the best and the worst of our society and of individuals. And so people are pointing to the inequality that is exacerbated by the pandemic, and this is across all areas. Many people who are don't have as many access to resources, and who are underprivileged to begin with, are in a much worse situation during the pandemic. It's the folks that have to go out and work jobs where they're delivering food, for example, or interacting with people that can't just stay at home the way that a lot of our tech workers are able to just stay at home and hold up, are much more vulnerable to both contracting COVID-19 and then also having negative outcomes, because especially in places like the United States where I live, there is not even access to healthcare. And so it's just deeply problematic, because all of these inequalities that we've already baked into our system become even worse. I've been encouraged to see how many people in the software freedom community have been able to weather the storm, because they are able to hold up, work on their tech jobs, and it's hard to be isolated, but they're able to protect themselves and their families, and to be able to keep food on the table and to keep paying rent. And that is simply not the case for everyone, and we're still all of these opportunities that we have in tech are generally have been unevenly available to people. And so, free software, it clearly has the potential to provide opportunities and empower those who are disadvantaged. It's one of the reasons why I feel so passionately about software freedom. It's about democratizing our technology, but at the same time, I don't know if it actually is doing that, because we have not done a wonderful job of bringing education and bringing software freedom solutions to people who are in disadvantaged communities. We've had a lot of rhetoric about it, but we have not necessarily been able to have that many. We haven't had that many successes in actually taking action to spread the access to software freedom and the access to technology, and using software freedom as a mechanism for doing that. And so one of the projects that Conservancy is involved in, and me personally, and is Outreachy, which was formed as the outreach program for women when it was originally conceived in the GNOME community, and then KDE has been a participant over the years as well. So Outreachy is an internship program that provides opportunities to people who are impacted by systemic bias and who are underrepresented, and who are impacted by that underrepresentation. And so the program is run now such that applicants write an essay to explain how they've experienced systemic bias, how they've been underrepresented, and how that affects their lives. And so having this this program became even more essential during the pandemic. Our application rates went through the roof, and we've worked really hard to try to expand the program during this time, because we see how essential it is. We also, Outreachy had a travel stipend built into it, where we encouraged people to go and attend free software conferences. But obviously, since none of that is happening now, we turned that into stipends, and we paid them out to past interns who could have traveled as well, to help people who have already documented themselves as being impacted by bias and underrepresentation, to help weather through the storm. And so, I'm proud that's something that that I've been involved with, and we worked really hard to try to expand the program. So even though a lot of corporate funding has contracted during this time, we've worked really hard to try to increase fundraising so we could increase the number of interns that we have participating in Outreachy. And I'm really proud to say that we're about to announce that we have approximately 70 interns for the current round, which is the biggest round that we've done by far. Usually we're at around 50 interns for a round. And so we worked really, really hard for that. So so someone's asking if people can read the papers of folks that submitted their application, if they could read their applications, and no, we don't make those public, because I'm worried about we actually just we delete as much information as we can, because we recognize that that all these essays, and when you read them, there's so many of them contain a lot of really personal information, where people talk about their bad experiences, and it could be identifying. So we don't want to risk exposing people's personal information, or inadvertently giving enough information that that someone could figure out who our applicants were. But we work really hard to evaluate our essays, and as a consequence, feel really good about that. And so even though in this last round, we can't provide, even though we're providing a lot more internships than we did, we're going to be unable to provide as many internships as I would like to, or as are needed. There's a huge need right now. We had 3,000 applicants to Outreachy over the last round. So I'm proud we can do our part, and hopefully we can do more in the future. So that's that's where we are with that. But nonetheless, I think one of the wins is that we are able to scale up Outreachy and give people opportunities that they need to be able to get into this situation where they can be one of the people who who has a comfortable tech job and can provide for their families without having to risk unsafe practices. I'm being asked what our selection process is. I don't want to get too into it because of this isn't a talk about Outreachy, but we do have a really careful rubric that we use when we when we evaluate our applications. So one of the big wins, to just move on to a slightly different topic of the pandemic, is that people really understand that they're reliant on tech in a way that they didn't before. While I think a lot of people thought of software as a tool, like they would look at like a hammer or something, they looked at their computers and their handheld computers, aka phones, as if they were just these things that they could use whenever they felt like it. Being in the pandemic made people realize how much they're reliant on it. For a lot of people, their phones and their computers were their only lifelines to the people they loved, and so they realized that they are reliant on tech in ways that they hadn't realized before. That I think that is a huge win. And I think people also in the pandemic realize, as, for example, I have relatives that now use the word Zoom bombing, like they know what those things mean. They understand that there are surveillance components to this technology, and they understand how critical it is, that they shrug a little bit less than they used to about the fact that companies are collecting a tremendous amount of data on them. So they realize that they're more reliant on technology than ever before. It's like a completely different situation than it was, even 2 or 3 years ago. And I have far-flung relatives who are, non-technical or just never saw, despite every time me talking about software freedom as best as I could at family functions and things like that, finally over the last year texting me and saying, or emailing me and saying, I'm so glad you introduced me to these ideas before I started reading all of these articles, because now I see that these issues are really important, and I'm so glad you've been working on it. And so it's fascinating, and it means that we're in a really exciting time where there is a lot of opportunity. And I think that the part of the problem is that folks are really beaten down by the fact that they have no choice with respect to these technologies. So they know that they're reliant on them, and they can see their use of their technology in a way they never did before, but they're every bit is feeling like they don't have that much control. There is that power dynamic, right? And they're not in the power seat. This is a slide I like because it has a picture of an art exhibit where this artist put out printed out the terms and conditions on different colored papers for different common services that people use. There was a study done that showed that you would have to do nothing for a full-time job except read these terms of services for 3 months before you could read just the terms of service that the average person agrees to in the ordinary online services that they provide. And they've become desensitized to them. We all have. We all just click agree, just I agree, because you don't really have a choice. And when someone's invited you to a teleconference and you have to set up an account and agree to terms, you're going to do that before the conference starts. Right? You're not going to have time to consider and read all of these terms of services, and we're not doing a great job as a society at putting these things in check. So I think that there's this is sort of the downside of that, and so one of the things that I've been working on with Molly DeBlanc is to create a declaration of digital autonomy, where we look holistically at all of the at what we rely on for our technology, and coming up with principles so that we can evaluate our technology and demand that we have better. So I recommend checking out techautonomy.org and let us know if you have any suggestions or feedback. I think that would be really helpful. It's just a draft. And so we really want to get input from people about what should be better. We haven't been thinking about our technology as holistically as we should. We software freedom advocates have been siloed in our space, and other people who are focused on who are focused on other areas of ethical technology are siloed in their spaces, and we need to do more work about that. I've been doing that in the medical devices space as recently as 5 years ago. I didn't even know there's an advocate who whose name is Hugo Campos, who has the same heart condition as me. He has exactly the same condition as me, but he advocates for patient access to data. And there are the folks that are doing the hacking work on medical devices, and we, until somewhat recently, were not well communicated with each other at all. So we need to do more of that organizing and communication so that we all work together and think about our technology as holistically, because otherwise software freedom is not going to be a part of that discussion. And we have to articulate why software freedom is important as part of that whole discussion, and frame it that way, so that we can bring the discussion to something that we can actually act on. One of the biggest wins in the pandemic is that we, in the free software community, we're here for each other. We're a community that talks to each other, that knows how to communicate, but also we care about each other. So, I think that is just like one of the things that's the most powerful during the pandemic, to remember that we've set up these great communities and we support each other. We at Conservancy have chats every Thursday, and that will happen in 2 hours, a little bit over 2 hours, in the Conservancy IRC channel. So, and I welcome you to join. And the idea is just a place to chat. We talk about important software freedom issues, but also just hang out on IRC. Yeah, there's some. I was distracted trying to look for a moment at the chat in the sidebar to answer some of those questions, but I don't see that. Anyway, so coming back around, because we're getting to the end of this and supporting each other, nobody guessed the right conference at the beginning of the talk. The conference that I linked to was the Desktop Summit in Gran Canaria in 2009, which is one of the very first conferences that I participated wholeheartedly in, and it was really fun for me because I was a lawyer to both KDE and GNOME at that time. I was still at the Software Freedom Law Center, and it was super fun to flip between the GNOME community and the KDE community. And the reason why I'm coming back to that is that in 2009 in Gran Canaria, I felt like I honestly, at that point, I had felt like I was coming to software freedom too late. I felt like everything had happened already. I felt like oh, if I'd only been there in 2000 and 2002, 2000, if I'd only had the confidence when I first started participating in 2005 to become more involved and to do more, I felt like I had missed it. It all happened. All the important things were done. And looking back, that is so laughable. Like there's so much has happened in the time since then. And I wish that I had realized that at that Desktop Summit in Gran Canaria, that so much would happen and that everyone who was there was a part of it. And so if this is your first conference, if LAS is your first conference, or if you've started quite recently, don't feel like your opinion doesn't matter, and don't feel like so much has already happened and you've missed it, because what matters is what's happening right now. If we've learned anything from the pandemic, it's that, and Richard Cushing, I'm so glad you're here for this being your first conference. That is so cool. And Mateus Gires too, fantastic. So like if we learn anything from the pandemic, is that we don't know what's coming down the road. We have to be ready. We have to work together, and we are constantly need to iterate what we're doing for software freedom to get people to understand it and to make a world where we can rely on our technology better. And I'm so hoping that I can see all of you soon in person, so that we can meet and have those kinds of fantastic personal dynamics that we have when we get together. But I know that the fact that we can participate here and now and here, and also Charles Sirois, I'm glad you're here too. And so I look forward to meeting you all and seeing you all. Thank you so much for participating in this, because together we will figure out what we've learned from the pandemic. We will celebrate our wins, learn from our losses, and be better together. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm going to see if there's time for, I think I answered most of the questions as they came up in the chat. I think Christy said there were shared notes. It's very strange giving like a talk to like just seeing myself and not anybody else.
Yeah, and I think that one of the questions is also interesting because it says that do you think, so I'm going first with the first question. How and why do you think we failed in the adaptation of these different free and open tools? So maybe that's somehow related to the beginning of your presentation. If you'd like, we can first answer this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I covered that. I think we were ready with our technological solutions and we were ready with our rhetoric, but we didn't bring it together. We didn't provide the infrastructure, and we didn't advertise it in a coordinated way at the beginning of the pandemic. We didn't empower individuals, and we were all struggling independently to try to deal with our own personal issues during the pandemic. I know anybody who was a parent had little kids that were home all the time. Anyone who, anyone who has an underlying condition was terrified that we were going to get sick, and many people were dealing with being sick and dealing with loved ones who were sick. And so there were significant challenges, but I think that what we can do is we can learn from that and come up with a more coordinated way of dealing with these issues in the future. And it's in part in coming together in conferences, but it's also through a lot of collective action and having our rhetoric ready for the next time that it happens, as well as our solutions.
Great. The second question, do you think adoption of remote tools will stay for future FOSS events after the pandemic ends, considering from a point of view where it helps spread out the word for people who are unable to travel?
Yes, I think that we've learned a lot from that in that regard too, is I think that we're going to continue to provide better mechanisms for people to participate remotely. And so having conferences where there's a hybrid component is really good. I think one of the things that I loved is that I might do more of in the future is having and we might do at Conservancy is having pre-recorded talks where the speaker can engage with questions during the talk, as I said at the beginning, to heckle themselves, which is a pretty silly way of referring to it. But I think that a lot of those mechanisms, to the extent that we're doing remote events, will stick. And I think that having remote sessions that are tacked onto in-person conferences will be essential. And I hope that all the conference organizers continue to evaluate that. I see there's a question about GPL or later, which I think is really out of scope for this. So but that was the end of the questions. The rest of these were for the previous talk.
Yes, so I guess that we had these two questions at the shared notes for you to answer. Thank you so much for joining us on this lesson. Really hope to see you in person soon.
Me too. Thank you so much for organizing it, and to all of the organizers. You are all so awesome, and this is so hard to do. So I think everybody give your muted applause to them, because they are fantastic. Thank you so much.